I just wrote recently about loss, and I think I put this on Facebook. I wrote about loss as I imagined deep time, deep evolutionary time, all the billions and billions of years that it took to create stars and planets and supernovae and stellar objects and all of that, and all the cascading materialities that have that is rolling on and regurgitating and reproducing and creating anew and doing new things. And how all of this, all these billions of heavy ontological moments cascades and moves and crashes into the production of the seed's skin, the skin of a seed, right? I'm looking at how the mighty produces the fragile and the vulnerable, right? Right, something so soft. And I write in that post that I think it took more energy for the universe to create the skin of a seed than it did to create the stars. I don't know about the physics of that, but there's something very powerful about explosions congealing into something so soft and ethereal like the skin of a seed. But then think about what the universe does next with that membrane, that membranous material. It allows it to rupture, right? It's soft because it wants it to rupture. It throws it into the ground, or we throw it into the ground as part of the universe, and then something happens. The seed becomes something different. It doesn't keep its identity. It ruptures it, and then it becomes something different, right? It becomes a forest. It becomes a tree. It becomes a sapling. It becomes a new plant, right? It becomes food. And this is the reason why I think loss is, even though we don't have a name for it in this way, or maybe we don't notice it in this way, loss is the universe's most exquisite creation. That the universe engineers loss as a way of reproducing or producing novelty, right? Imagine how stars fail and their failure becomes human skin or human bodies, right? I like to say that the failure of the star, or rather that the failed star shines brighter than the star that is intact, because it spills its chemicals and its chemistry and its logic, and that logic becomes our organelles and our hair and everything, right? So in a sense, loss is in a sense how the universe invites new things to emerge, right? But modernity is the attempt to stave off and quarantine ourselves against loss, right? I'm a recovering clinical psychologist, and I was trained to make people productive, to get them back into neurotypical pathways, the normal path, right? To bring them back into the rat race, right? I call myself a recovering psychologist, and I've done so for a long time, because I recognize that there's something about the edges, about loss and the softness of it that is really a turning point for politics, right? And that is an invitation for us to make art and to rethink how we move with others and move with ourselves and move with community.
So how, with this new way of being, after having navigated loss and shapeshifted and something new is emerging, how do we then meet the machine without becoming the machine again? How are we pattern interrupting consciously? Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. Has anyone here seen a death spiral, an ant death spiral? Has anyone here seen it? There's another name for it. It's called an ant mill or ant milling. So to the extent that let me ask another question. This might be interesting for you as a response to this question. How many of you as kids, or even probably now, it's okay to confess, it's not a sin, this is not a confessional, but how many of you played with ants? Maybe you saw their lines and you put your foot, in Laura herself. Oh, Carol, this is, so many of us. It's okay. It's okay. All right. Yes, there's a howness to it that, that brings us to that place where we're constantly disrupting their trails. But here's something interesting. And I'm building some theoretical scaffolding to come to the question of how we break away from the machine, right? Mm. And more centrally, how grief enacts that. Okay. And I'm going by way of ants. So this is going to be interesting. But if you kept doing that over and over again, disrupting ants, they will start to change their shape, literally. The interruption disrupts their morphology. Ant morphology is dependent on pheromones. You probably have heard of pheromones and pheromone trails, right? It's a chemical secreted from their bodies. The queen ant secretes pheromones that are chemicals, semiochemicals that actually shape how the ants show up in the world. So if you kept doing that, there would be a pheromone response that would reshape how ants show up. But it's also interesting because pheromone trails are cartographies, they're maps. The ants use pheromone trails to navigate. And I find that really interesting as just to libate the grounds of this response to your question, Laura, to notice that bodies do not precede bodily movements, right? How bodies move is how bodies become embodied. Mm. Does that make sense? That it's not that we have bodies and then they move through the world. It's that movements are bodies. Mm. How we move, where we go is how we become embodied, right? It's true for ants. I think it's true for us too, that we are constantly shape-shifting and moving and responding to the world. It's not that there is a prior independent subject that moves into the world. It's that how movements occur shapes bodies, right? We're literally embodied movements. Or like I say, it's not that everything moves, it's that every move things. Just poetry, right? But that brings me to a more fascinating phenomenon, and that's the death spiral. Sometimes that pheromone trail goes, something wrong happens. And I don't want to say wrong, like ontologically wrong, but something wrong in relation to the rest of the colony happens. And ants, especially army ants who cannot see, who don't need to see, because they need a pheromone trail, they break away from the colony accidentally. Maybe you put your foot in there and they go round in circles. You can actually go on Google right now, on YouTube, and just see ants, sometimes as wide as a stadium and sometimes as small as to be able to fit on your table, right? They go round in circles, and they keep going round until they die. They get exhausted and die. And it is near impossible to break away from that circle. It is very impossible, or very rare, and quite impossible to break away from that death spiral. It feels like us, doesn't it? It feels like our response to things, our civilizational response to chaos and change and injustice. It seems we know we are stuck in a death spiral. Maybe it's not ant milling, maybe it's anthro milling. Like we are, in a sense, death spiraling, and we don't know how to stop. So my question to you is, how do you suppose ants might break away from that? Let's stay with ants for a moment. How do you think ants stray away from that kind of death spiraling? Does anyone have a clue? Maybe a solution to this crisis? A different probably, I don't know if that has been recorded, but the pheromone trail is very, because it's not just that there's a pheromone trail that hangs over the circle. It's that within their bodies, they're secreting their cartography, and then they get stuck. The stuckness is how they are following each other. And they're literally telling each other, we're almost there. We're about to get there. Just another turn, just another turn, just another turn, and until they die. It's like NASCAR on steroids. Is that the right metaphor? NASCAR? It's a very American metaphor. But you probably know what I mean. So yes, I don't know that step outside of culture in whatever ways work. It's not easy to step out. That's the point here. It's not. I'm staying with Laura's question. Like, how do we break out of, the machine? It's not easy to break out. In fact, I would say it's probably impossible for us to do it by ourselves. But one way that it happens with ants is by infection, which I think is fascinating. There is a fungal entity, a fungus called Ophiocodiceps unilateralis. Codiceps, just think of it as codiceps. Codiceps sporulates, spills into the environment. Think of a jungle or something where it's located from a station. And it settles these tiny spores. They infiltrate ants' bodies, right? And when they infiltrate it, they literally grow and take over the organs and the limbs and the shells and everything within the ants' bodies, except the brain. It's a very Lovecraftian, monstrous infiltration. And this is the phenomenon of the zombie ant, right? You probably have heard Sir Attenborough with his immaculate British accent speaking about the zombie ant. I cannot do an impression, I'm sorry. But yes, infection. The ants get infected, and so they take over. It's said to flood the ant's brain with hallucinogens, right? But it doesn't take over the brain. It just floods it with hallucinogens, and then it directs the ant away from whatever spiral or stuckness or colony that it's in. It's a strain away, right? The only way a break happens is by infection, right? Something from outside, so to speak, and inside outside, if you will, relational outside. Something from outside enacts an infiltration, converts the ant into a zombie ant, and then the zombie ant strays away. And under the influence of this fungus, the ant goes far away. It doesn't eat, it doesn't drink, it doesn't do anything. It just goes far because it doesn't need that anymore. The fungus is now controlling everything. And the ant goes to the underside of a leaf. and digs its mandibles into the leaf and dies there. And something starts to sprout out of the ant's head that looks like a satellite dish. It's very fascinating. And that becomes a new station for the fungus to start the cycle over again. And that's how cordyceps spreads, by infection. Now, I'm thinking, you might think, oh, that is irritating, that is shocking, that is monstrous, that is Lovecraftian, that is macabre. But I'm thinking about beyond our modern responses to how nature natures itself. I'm thinking about how humans are stuck and how we need to pair up with other allies, to pair up with other beings, to pair up with other concepts, to be infected ourselves in order to become more than human, as we've always been, right? Think about the pandemic. Think about all the years of studious scholarship and all that was wrought in those years of scholarship, all the activisms, all the photographic moments, all the conferences, COP7, COP8, COP9, COP10, COP11, COP12, all the conferences around climate chaos, all the legislation, all the power, all the Obama Kodak moments, all the celebrity Bono singing about everyone contributing to climate change, you know, but we couldn't do crap. Or all the things we could do could not get people to pause, to stay still. And then a tiny, infinitesimal, near invisible critter steals into the economy, grounds all the planes, and sends people home. It will take an animist cosmology for us to notice that we cannot save ourselves on our own. We really need a sense of strain away. And to enact that, we need to pair up with the world in different ways, right? We're stuck ourselves. But to unravel this knot, you need something outside of the knot to unravel it, right? And this is where grief comes in. Grief as infection. Grief as an infection. There is no diagnostic criteria for grieving in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, right? But there is a sense in which there is an excessiveness about grieving that is worrisome to modern arrangements. It doesn't feel right. And I can speak of that as a person who has sat with clients in therapeutic settings in Africa, right? In Eastern Nigeria, in a neuropsychiatric hospital where I was trained, right? Grieving became, within colonial settlements, became this disturbing immigrant, right? And it seems the United States being a hallmark, a benchmark for civilizational progress, would describe it best as enshrined in its own constitution, the pursuit of happiness. There isn't a pursuit of grieving, there is a pursuit of happiness, joy, positivity. We are coddled within a civilization that has no space for grieving. First of all, I think grief is shriveled as this inconvenient event, right? Whereas I think of grieving as the technology for emergence, right? I think of grieving as cosmological. I think of grieving as how seeds fall into the ground or how seasons change. Maybe grief is how a tree knows how to shed its leaf, right? Maybe grief is implied in how the world knows how to lose itself or how a bear knows how to hibernate. Maybe this posture of squeezing our bodies into new postures, as grief invites us to do, maybe that is the posture of amniotic emergence, right? The invitation to So grief seems like there's a lot of climate grief at the moment. Mm. If you read the new IPCC report, there's a call for climate grief. But the way grief is instrumentalized as a pathway to joy doesn't seem to really pay homage to what grief is doing. It just feels like, oh, we're sad. Now let's take our sadness and do something about it. Let's walk in and save the day. But that's not the point. There is a point at which hope gets in the way. Mm. I'm using the term of cruel optimism by Laurent Berlant. There are moments when hope and optimism becomes an obstacle to flourishing, right? And when the invitation to stay with grieving becomes an activism in itself, becomes a sharing of edges and borders and boundaries with what the world is doing. I think that is what grief is doing. It's the trafficking of edges, right? It's the transference of borders. It is the invitation to lose our skins, right? Maybe that's what grief is ontologically, speculatively, within an animist multi-species salon. Maybe grief is how an ant and a fungus become allies and make art. Maybe our bodies are being invited to make new forms of art, new forms of posture. This is why I really am into performative arts and dancing. Maybe there is something about grief that flails the body and opens it up and closes it simultaneously, but stretches the body liminally, stretching the tendrils of our posturized identities into new forms, new ways of being alive, new ways of sensing. Could it be that clarity, the empiricism of science, is getting in the way of us noticing that maybe when tears fall in our eyes, that's when we see differently. Maybe we need to look away at, right? So in a sense, staying with grief as a vocation, not as an inconvenience, but as a vocation, the way the Aztecs stayed with diseased corn, right? What American farmers will call, United States American farmers will call corn snot, right? The Aztecs called sleeping excrescence, and they gave it the name Huitlacoche, right? And they did not cure this thing, this disease, this fungus. They ate it up. Maybe grief is a call to diet. Maybe it's an invitation to a feast, right? Maybe there's an aesthetic without objects here, an invitation to eat the meal of our times, to share the bounty of not figuring out what to do next. And maybe in doing that, we are changed. We are metamorphosed by this infectious infiltration. Yeah, I'll stop there for now.